Good morning. My name is Andrew Redman. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all this morning to this conversation. We're so pleased to be co-sponsoring this with the University of California, San Diego Center for U.S. Mexico Studies. Tomorrow, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, Amlo, will visit the White House for the first time since last November's North American Leaders Summit meeting. And this will be their first bilateral meeting. The visit, of course, comes just days after the second anniversary of the USMCA's entry into force and of the horrible discovery of over 50 migrants in a trailer outside of San Antonio. It also comes about a month after the Summit of the Americas, which AMLO did not attend. So there are clearly a lot of issues that may come up during the visit, many opportunities to collaborate to address shared challenges, and certainly some areas of tension, as has always been the case in what is the most impactful bilateral relationship for both countries. To explore the issues, discuss the implications, and identify potential opportunities to make progress, we've assembled a distinguished panel, and we're really looking forward to their remarks and to an interactive discussion over the next hour. We invite those of you watching live to submit questions via email, mexico@wilsoncenter.org, or to tag us on Twitter @Mexico Institute. My co-moderators, Rafael Fernandez de Castro, Director of the Center for U.S. Mexico Studies, and Lila Abed, Deputy Director at the Mexico Institute, will try to weave your questions into what we're sure will be a spirited discussion. I'm going to briefly introduce the panel before we kick things off. It's a well-known panel, and so with their consent, I'm going to give short versions of the bio. Their full bios are available on the event webpage. Starting with Ambassador Marta Barcena, who is a career diplomat, was Mexico's first female ambassador to Washington, and served previously as Mexico's ambassador to Turkey, concurrently with Georgia and the republics of Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, and to the Kingdom of Denmark, concurrent with Norway and Iceland. She is a member of the Mexico Institute's advisory board. Viridiana Rios is a columnist with El País, an instructor of U.S. Mexico politics at Harvard Summer School, and a former global fellow of the Mexico Institute. Luis Rubio is chairman of Mexico Evalúa, a former president of the Consejo Mexicano de Asuntos Internacionales, chairman of the Center for Research and Development in Mexico, and both a global fellow and member of the Mexico Institute's advisory board. And last but not least, Andrew Seeley is president of the Migration Policy Institute. Andrew is a member of the Mexico Institute advisory board and was the initial director of the Mexico Institute and is now a senior advisor to us. I'm going to now turn it over to my counterpart, Rafael Fernandez de Castro, to kick things off. Over to you, Rafael.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to join forces with the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center. And let me invite all of you to watch what we're doing together next Friday on an assessment of AMLO's visit to Biden. That will be at a more convenient time, California time, 9 o'clock, which is 11 o'clock Mexico City time. Marta, I'm delighted to be with good friends here. And Marta, I wanted to start with you. You were AMLO's ambassador for 2 years in Washington. Mm-hmm. And Luis Echeverría just died last Friday. And Luis Echeverría was a Mexican president who used to be very tough with Washington publicly, but in private, he basically followed the status quo. Let me ask you, Marta, how is AMLO on private with the Americans? Is he going to be, you expect him to be very tough as he's in Las Mañaneras with Biden? And a follow-up question, Marta, will be that we see that there's some clouds in the horizon between Mexico and the US because these constant attacks or frictions created by AMLOs in Las Mañaneras, like the Statue of Liberty and things like that. Would you say that the most important issue in this coming visit is to try to clear up the panorama and perhaps the frictions between the two heads of states? Thank you, Marta, for being here. Yours is the floor.
Thank you, Rafael, and thank you, Andrew, and all my colleagues in this webinar, Andrew, Celi, Viridiana, Luis, Lila. It's really it's a good time to have this discussion. On the first question, I do not think that President López Obrador follows like the example of President Echeverría to being very tough in public and very soft in private. I think that President López Obrador is like always like torn into two directions. In what he thinks in an idealistic way, for example, in migration, saying, oh, if the US needs workers, they should do something to give them a legal course to be there. And in a very pragmatist way, to say, okay, there are certain things that I want to do, and that those are my main priorities internally, but I know that I have some limits. So he will try to play with the limits that he has in the relationship with the US. And I think this is the case of energy, that I'm absolutely convinced that he thought that with the chapter on energy on the USMCA, he interpreted it as that he had a free way or free reign to do whatever he wanted in reforms on energy. There were several of us that explained to him that there were other chapters of USMCA that could be violated by the measures that his government was taking on energy. But he was convinced that with the chapter on energy, he had a free reign. So here, I think he has realized that he didn't have that free reign, and that is why he has been receiving the US energy companies in Palacio Nacional and trying to find an accommodation with them. This is just to give two examples on how he is pulled between what he wants to do internally from his idealistic point of view, and that he's a pragmatist, and he has always been a pragmatist since he was the head of government in Ciudad de Mexico. My experience in the 2 years that I was the Mexican ambassador to the US is that he always listened to me. And in most of the occasions, he paid heed, he followed my advice. I really don't know how the interaction is taking place now between Palacio Nacional, Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores, and the Mexican Embassy in Washington and other advisors that, at least in the 2 years that I was ambassador to the US, were not so present or didn't have so much incidence in the decision-taking process in Palacio Nacional by President López Obrador. So I would say that in this visit, he also will be torn between these two trends, trying to explain to President Biden what is his ideals for Mexico and why he thinks self-sufficiency in energy is good for Mexico, and why having a migration agreement is good, and also understanding, and maybe this is the most important part of the visit, I think he has to understand from the highest level in the US, what are the limits the US are seeing in the relationship with Mexico? Where is the thin red line in which things can get very difficult? Yes. And he also has to tell his US interlocutors which is the thin red line for the Mexican government. So in that sense, I follow up to your second questions. Does this visit is important? Yes, it's very important. And it's useful to clarify where are the thin red lines for both sides, and in which areas you can cooperate immediately and have some progress, which areas in which the differences are so big that maybe you have to work on shorten them. And then maybe take, a clear cut on where are we now in the progress of the high-level economic dialogue? Where are we in the progress of the high-level security dialogue? What are the real chances for a migratory reform in the US, which I personally think politically in the US is not viable, and not in this moment. And what are we going to do in the next 2 years? Because then the elections, the presidential elections in both countries are going to be extremely difficult. And I really hope that Mexico does not come back as one of the main issues of the elections and as the piñata of the elections. And I will cut short there to give chance to the other colleagues. Thank you, Rafael.
Thank you, Marta, for a very straightforward answer. We know that, yes, you told President Amlo, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, what you thought was important, and thank you very much for that. Lila, up to you.
Yes, just to echo what Andrew and Rafael said at the beginning of this webinar, it's a pleasure to welcome you all, and it's a pleasure to be moderating this great panel. Bidi, I turn to you. Ambassador Barcena touched upon really important subjects on the bilateral relationship, particularly migration and AMLO's energy policies. But I think one of the things that the Mexican president mentioned this morning in his mañanera is that he's willing to work with President Biden on inflation. And so I think here something about trade, right? USMCA, which Ambassador Barcena also touched upon. But do you think these are also going to be at the forefront of the bilateral agenda? And is this part of what AMLO is going to consider a success during his visit?
Thank you, Lila, for such a wonderful question. And thank you also to the very good friends that joined me today in this panel. To answer that question, we need to first understand what are the objectives of López Obrador with this visit. And I would classify these objectives as two. So on one hand, of course, there is the issue of discussing the main issues of the bilateral agenda. So that is in terms of inflation, how we make sure that value chains are more efficient, of course, how to increase temporary work visas to order migration flows, how to get to food security measures by joining efforts between Mexico and the U.S., and of course, the security agenda under the framework of the bicentennial framework, right? But to think that discussing the bilateral agenda is AMLO's main objective, I think it would be a little bit naive. If AMLO I think, and you know, like following AMLO closely and all of his appearances and his, you know, speeches about this, if AMLO has decided to visit Washington, it is more because of a second objective, right, which is related to his own agenda, as always. So the second and most important reason why AMLO will be there is to show himself and to show to the world that he is the unique and truthful regional leader of Latin America. He wants to be the older brother of Latin America, who dares to A, negotiate with Washington measures that benefit not only Mexico, but the region as a whole. B, to do it despite of having dared to be uncomfortable during the Summit of the Americans. And C, to have a one-to-one special relationship with the US. So this meeting is a performance, but it's not a performance for the Mexican public. It's not a performance for Washington's diplomacy. It is a performance for El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and other Latin American countries to confirm the power that Mexico, or most importantly, López Obrador, can have as a leader of the region. For this reason, I think many of the topics that AMLO will bring to the table will be addressed as a regional thing, right? He's not going to be there only talking about the U.S. Mexico relationship. He's going to be there talking also about policies that are going to influence Latin America and particularly Central America. So for example, the integration of the region. AMLO has said in several occasions that he wants Latin America to be similar to the European Union. we are not sure exactly what he means by that, and certainly he does not mean to have a single currency, but he is interested on being the leader of such a union. He wants support for Central America. Of course, he has requested $4 billion, if I remember correctly, from the US to support, and he also wants to extend Mexican social programs that he has designed, such as Sembrando Vida or Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, to several other countries in Latin America. So López Obrador is a leader that is a little bit different from previous Mexican presidents, particularly recent previous Mexican presidents, in one specific way, right? That he is not only interested in having a relationship between Mexico and the US, and to have that relationship at the expense of the relationship of Mexico with the rest of the continent, or particularly with Central America. He is a leader that aspires to create a Latin American union and to use that union to be the base of his negotiation with the United States. So success for him is that, right? So when you ask me, Lila, how does success looks? Well, success looks like López Obrador becoming this leader. And I think the very fact of being there in Washington after not being in the Summit of the Americans is for him a success in itself.
Really interesting, BD, because I think the fact that he boycotted the Summit of the Americas shows his, commitment to the whole region. And I think he's trying to play a leadership role, right? Mexico at the forefront of most Latin American countries. I now turn to my boss, Andrew Redmond, for the next question.
Thanks, Leila, and thank you all again for being here. And I'm going to turn to Luis Rubio, and actually I'd like to follow on where Viri left off in terms, Luis, of maybe giving us your thoughts on how does the visit fit into AMLO's domestic agenda, or as Viri suggests, is it in fact really not about his domestic agenda, but about a broader hemispheric agenda?
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you, Rafa and Lila, for this opportunity. I think that the point of departure is that AMLO is the first president since the 1980s who does not share a common vision with the US. And that one should keep us the framework of reference for his presidency and for the visit. He is also at the stage of his presidency where everything is about his popularity. In this sense, Biden is no more than a cog in the pursuit of his objective. President López Obrador has been willing to incur in any cost in order to enhance his standing and his popularity. And therefore, the visit appears to give him a stage that he did not have so far. He is also a master at appearing to be the avenging character in his epic against the rich, the exploiters, the powerful, and so on. And in this narrative, President Biden is also a perfect target. And third, clearly, this strategy is extraordinarily risky for the president and for Mexico, because he's disregarding the fact that he's dealing with Mexico's most important relationship and the world superpower. I agree with Ambassador Barcena that he knows what are the limits, but I believe that it's not because he's pragmatic, but because he is a politician who understands the power and the limits to power. He has, in fact, spent months provoking the US government, threatening and snubbing the US president, and more recently offending its population by this grandiose standing on the idea of destroying the Statue of Liberty. So I believe that there are two constituencies that he's aiming for. The first is that there's still a crowd in Mexico that loves a macho president that can stand up to the powerful neighbor of the North. This constituency has been shrinking over the past half century, but standing up to the powerful is obviously profitable to AMLO, and he does it masterfully. But what clearly motivates the Mexican president is the regional leadership, as really expressed before. He saw this very clearly during the Summit of the Americans. He was able to threaten and to, in fact, boycott the summit, and that was at no cost to him. He has even been rewarded with a coveted visit to the White House tomorrow, where he'll probably lecture President Biden on Mexican history the way he did the last time he showed up. The point is that being at the White House after undermining the summit and violating a key principle of the bilateral relationship, that there should be no surprises, that there should be that red lines should be established in private, not in public, is an amazing feat for the Mexican president. The lesson that he inexorably derived from the stunt with the summit of the Americas is that there is no cost to any action that he may take, and therefore that it is he who drives the relationship. So in conclusion, I think that he aims at being shown respect for his boldness and as an accessory to Mexican sovereignty, both terms being frequent in his rhetoric. In other words, his only objective is the picture which will validate his prank. It will also show that it is he who drives the relationship as he pleases. The US might be a superpower, but certainly not in this case, or not so far. And that is pure gold for the president.
Thanks, Luis. Thoughtful as always, and I'm glad it will encourage the panel to exchange views back and forth as you have just done in just a moment. But I think Rafael has one more opening question, and then we'll start the interchange.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me go to you, Andrew Seeley. We all know that there's been a sort of a permanent crisis in the U.S. Mexico border. There's lots of Mexicans, Central Americans, and people from everywhere trying to come into the U.S. And Republicans say that Biden is weak on immigration. Do you really think that that's why Amlo is so powerful vis-a-vis Biden? Because Biden badly needs Mexico to try to stop those migrants in transit to come into the U.S. Mexico border? Thank you, Andrew, for being with us.
Well, thank you, Rafael, and it's great to be with you and with everyone else on this panel. I think that is part of the subtext of the relationship always on the practical side, but I would say there's also a meta narrative there's also a big picture issue on the Biden side here. People have talked about the López Obrador side, and López Obrador clearly, this is both a picture for the Mexican public. It's part of his, he stands up to the man and is able then to still get an invitation to go to the White House. It is his leadership in Latin America, as Luis said, it's the photo. I mean, I think it's true. On Biden's side, I think you have to look at this, in tandem with, for example, the visit to Saudi Arabia that President Biden is making. I mean, right now there's an alignment, a realignment going on in the world. It's around Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And Biden is gathering his allies, including those he has conflict with. I mean, he has made a decision, look at this, even the visit to Venezuela, was a lower level, not a presidential visit a few months ago. I mean, Biden has made a decision that the world is now split into different camps and that the Ukraine war is the axis around which this is dividing. And whether or not he has differences with López Obrador is less important than making sure he can manage that relationship, right? He'd rather have him close than far away. And Biden is a man who likes personal diplomacy as well as López Obrador. These guys are, they're old school politicians who like sitting face to face, looking in each other's eyes, and having a negotiation. So I think that's sort of the big picture. I think that in the smaller picture, the issues that are probably on the agenda are obviously energy and migration, probably no more important than migration from Biden's perspective. I think there are three things at least that they will talk about. And we have to remember that, presidential visits are also action forcing opportunities, right? So some of this is what happens between the two of them. And as Marta said, I think, it is true also. Some of this is sort of showing the red lines and what's possible, a little bit of reality. What are the political pressures, and presidents like doing this, by the way, right? They're the ultra politicians. They look at each other in the eyes and they sort of, try and lay down what their constraints are, right? And what their pressures are with each other. But these are also action forcing opportunities in which you have lots of other agencies in both governments doing lots of things. Ambassador Barcena remembers this, having been through this many times. This is these are action forcing opportunities. A visit of a head of state where the entire bureaucracy on both sides starts moving, right? So we also have to look at what's going on in that broader thing. So on migration, I think there's three things that are moving, and this may be separate than what they actually talk about. I mean, these will all be on the agenda, but I think it's a little bit separate. One is the day-to-day management of the relationship, and there's no question that there's just lots of making sure that there aren't misunderstandings going on. There is something that's happened that's very subtle recently, which is that there is some pre-screening of migrants going on in Mexico for people who have humanitarian needs or protection needs, and people then being channeled through ports of entry. This is something that the Mexican government is, in theory, not favorable to, but it's been done very quietly. It has been reported on in the press. I'm not revealing any confidences. This is something, I know about through the press only, but it is something that is going on that matters a great deal, where Haitians and Central Americans and others who have protection needs or specific humanitarian needs are actually being pre-screened in Mexico by other organizations, UN organizations or private organizations, and brought across. So there's a lot of that sort of day-to-day management that goes on, that is, just they want to maintain. And I think there's probably lots of conversations happening right now around this, and I'm sure they'll touch on that a little bit. Secondly, there's the question of migration control. And there the issue is, securing Mexico's southern border, which the US would love to do. It may be slightly hypocritical. We can always argue that, but the US always, this is true, administration to administration, the US would always rather have Mexico do immigration control rather than have to do it at the US border. But it's also something that López Obrador has been willing to do because it's an easy give for him. And then there's subtleties to the question. I mean, now it's not just Central Americans. For example, what do you do with Nicaraguans and Cubans or Venezuelans who the US government is not able to return to their countries because there are no return agreements right now in effect? And so the US would really like with those populations to have Mexico play a bigger role, more than with Central Americans. So there's some real nuances going on in this. And again, I'm not sure they're going to get into that kind of nuanced discussion, but it's certainly happening in the bureaucracy around, and it'll come up in some way in their conversations. And the third one is the question of legal pathways. And here the López Obrador government has actually been quite insistent that the US needs to figure out how to bring more people in. The only two ways that we have of doing this is the H-2 visas. The H-2 visa is an imperfect way of doing this, an agriculture H-2A and a non-agriculture H-2B visa for seasonal work. Very few people in Central America can access them, so there's a huge question about how you expand it for Central America. There's a question about how you expand it for Mexicans who may not be in traditional areas of recruitment. And I think there's a question around TN visas, which is the NAFTA visa for professionals that the Mexican government is likely to put on the table, of how you make it a lot easier for people in Mexico to access it. Because there's also pressures right now in the slow recovery from the recession in Mexico and a possible new recession of professionals who may want to come to the United States and may also be in the unauthorized flow. And there is the TN visa is a quite useful visa. It's very easy for Canadians to access. It's not as easy for Mexicans, and I have a feeling they'll put that on the table. But much of this is sort of, again, and I'll end with this, I think this is sort of background conversations going on between two governments. What's going to happen in the room is you're going to have López Obrador pushing for, maximum openness in the US, creating new legal pathways and, legalizing, people in the United States. And Biden is going to be saying, look, I can't do that without Congress. This is what I can do. You're going to have Biden saying, what I need you to do is X, Y, and Z in terms of controlling migration, in terms of letting us pre-screen people in Mexico. And López Obrador saying, I can't really do that either. I can do this, but I can't do that. A lot of this is going to be measuring those boundaries at the beginning, as Marta said earlier. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for introducing the global context. You're absolutely right. I mean, since Russia invaded Ukraine, this is a challenge for the U.S. Leadership in world affairs, and it's key for Biden. And Marta and Luis and Viri, back to you guys. Do you think that, and we all know that Amlo has not fully aligned with Biden in world affairs, especially on Russia. He has been easy with Russia, to put it mildly. And so to what extent, Marta and the rest of the panelists, do you think that Biden badly needs to align Mexico on its side? Because if that is happening, I believe that gives some power to Amlo. So back to you, Marta, or whoever wants to take the question.
Thank you, Rafael. So I think the Russian invasion to Ukraine really has caused big disruption. But I would not agree with you that Mexico has not aligned with the U.S. I mean, we have to divide the Mexican position like in two different aspects. The first one is that we have aligned totally with the U.S. and the European Union and other countries in United Nations, which was very important. We voted against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We voted in the Security Council. We voted in the General Assembly. We have been very active with France in trying to guarantee the access to humanitarian aid, which is extremely important. And we have been condemning all the blockades of the Black Sea. And so in that sense, I think Mexico has aligned itself with the US, and more than with the US, I would say Mexico has aligned itself with international law, because there is no way in the framework of international law of justifying the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Even most recently, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico signed a trilateral communique during the Summit of the Americas with the US and Canada, in which the US absolutely used the terms he has been using to condemn the Russian invasion to Ukraine, and Mexico subscribed it. What we have been different is in the imposing of sanctions. And we have to remember the traditional position, Rafael, that you know well, of Mexico regarding sanctions for many years. Mexico has been against the imposing of unilateral sanctions, always, because they say unilateral sanctions damage more the people than the government. And we are seeing that in a sense in Russia. And particularly also how the sanctions are damaging even other regions like the Middle East or Africa, which have to pay now higher prices for corn, for wheat, for fertilizers. And the only way that Mexico can join the imposing sanctions to Russia is that the sanctions are agreed by United Nations. And we know that this will not happen in the Security Council, and it will be very difficult to get a majority of 2/3 in the General Assembly to impose sanctions on Russia. And not only because of Mexico or Latin America, basically because of China, India, and most of the African countries. So that is the pragmatism and the reality that we have to take into account. So what President López Obrador and President Biden can agree upon or work upon on two issues on the impact of the Russian invasion to Ukraine? One is food security in the Americas. And Mexico, Canada, the US, Argentina, and Brazil are the 5 largest exporters of food in the world. So there is enough food in the continent. It's just that we have problems to distribute it. So, and we know that an increased food insecurity immediately has impacts on an increased migration. So this is an area in which both countries can work well. And I would say that our Ministry of Agriculture, particularly our Minister of Agriculture, which is very well respected in all Latin America, can be the leader on how to organize and work with FAO and other institutions on food security in the continent. And the other, which would be extremely interesting, is the discussion on energy security. So is energy security linked to self-sufficiency, or is energy security linked to a regional approach? And when I say a regional approach, there is a regional approach or sub-regional approach of North America, but also the whole regional approach of the continent, because you have an extra production of gas in Venezuela that is being flared. In Trinidad and Tobago, you have maybe the development of Vaca Muerta in Argentina. And we are seeing a transition in the energy markets to liquid natural gas, which is now the US, the greatest exporter in the world of LNG is the US. And they are willing to, and not only to finance the LNG plants in all the continents, in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. In the Atlantic to export to the Europe, and in the Pacific to export to Asia. And in that way, breaking in the future the control of Russia of the gas markets and the oil markets. So this is a long-term perspective for the US. So are they going to discuss it with President López Obrador and his team? Are they willing to take such a medium and long-term approach? I don't know. But this is two areas in which the impact of the Russian invasion to Ukraine impact the whole continent, not only the bilateral relationship, food security and energy security, and the recomposition of the energy markets. And I would like just to make a mention of what Viri says of President López Obrador as leader of the region. I think there would be different interpretations on that, because I think that a lot of public opinion in the US do not think that President López Obrador consolidated himself as leader of the region after not attending the Summit of the Americas. And that there were few countries that follow him, but not all of them. And second, I don't think that like in migration, now is a political time to discuss any model of integration like the European Union. And third, I can tell you, based on my experience, that in every discussion of the European Union and the US with Mexican governments, at least that's my experience in the last 3 governments, the US, the European Union always ask the opinion of the Mexican government of what was going on in Latin America. And
excuse me, please finish.
There.
Finish, Marta, sorry.
No.
Okay.
I end there.
Thank you, Marta. I was going to say thank you for this very thoughtful answer, and for a consumed diplomat as you are. But I will say that I wouldn't buy that Amlo is thinking on the Russian people when he says no to Washington. But I mean, I don't know. Back to you, Lila, and I wonder if any one of the panelists would like to weigh in into this international question.
Yes, Rafael, I think Luis. Yeah, sorry.
I'd just like to add one quick point. I think that if they get to talk about the issues that Ambassador Barcena has just mentioned, then we've made it. I think that from the US perspective, alignment is not exactly what they are looking for. They know that there are different positions. My sense is that as long as Mexico is not a nuisance, as long as Mexico cooperates, if one looks at it positively, in the issues that matter to the US along the borderline, meaning the kinds of issues that Andrew talked about, migration, where remain in Mexico and the like, as long as those issues are dealt with and other problems of Mexico do not spill over to the US, I don't believe that there's much more than the US needs from Mexico. So total alignment is not necessary. I would love to hear the 2 presidents talk about the kind of issues that Marta spoke about, because those are the really tough issues that the region needs, Mexico needs, and the US needs.
Thank you, Luis. Lila.
Yes, thank you. Just to remind all of our audience that you can send questions to our email, mexico@wilsoncenter.org, or to our Twitter account at Mexico Institute. We've received some questions from our audience, so I'd like to pose one of those to our panelists. And the first one is, it came here, let me pull it up. Well, I'll start with one and then I'll continue with the other one because it's not working for me for a second. Bidi and Andrew, I understand that the priorities on the bilateral agenda are going to be energy and migration. But I think one of the issues that continues to be a problem where there tends to not be a lot of trust is security cooperation. And particularly with, the results and the data coming from Mexico where homicides, femicides, they continue to rise. And with the, with certain articles that have come out in the media where cooperation with U.S. agencies, particularly like the DEA, have not been great in terms of its relationship with Mexican authorities. What is necessary, and can this visit really help to advance security cooperation among the two countries? Virdi, if you want to start, and then Andrew, if you have something to add.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Lila. So we need to understand how security issues have changed in Mexico over the last decade to understand how the relationship between the US and Mexico is changing on that regard too. So this is not anymore only about drug trafficking, and particularly about, as it used to be, sending cocaine to the US with big drug cartels operating in Mexico. Drug cartels have fractured, creating a much more diversified problem for Mexico, because fractured drug cartels have also diversified their criminal portfolio, leading to more domestic problems to Mexico. And B, the type of drug that is both consumed in the US and trafficked from the US to, from Mexico to the US has changed, right? So now we're observing way more fentanyl. Of course, marijuana is not anymore on business. I want to point, and I think this is critical to understand the incentives of Amlo, that the main problem in Mexico right now in terms of security is extortion, and is not like a form of extortion that is just like simple fraud. It's more like a mafia type of, like an Italian mafia type of extortion that has developed and that is affecting businesses, small businesses, production chains, and that is of course creating an increase in prices because of the costs of these extortions, right? So this, for Mexico in particular, this is not anymore the problem of drugs, or drugs, is part of the equation, but it's not the main thing that is affecting Mexico. That's why I believe when AMLO is talking about inflation, right, and he's talking about turning the region more competitive and turning production change more efficiently, he's actually also talking about security there, because what we are observing is that drug traffickers, or gangs, right? What they are doing now is charging production, forcing production to happen in some areas, like creating local monopolies or oligopolies in certain products, and therefore forcing prices up by their activities. So just to, I would end here, because I don't think we're talking anymore about security and alone by itself, right? We're talking about health issues, which is a wonderful addition, by the way, of the bicentennial framework. Health issues. We're talking about domestic crime in Mexico that is forcing prices up. We're talking about the lack of control of the state and the creation of Italian mafia kind of crime, which is not something we had before. And of course, we're talking about how Mexico needs to deal with these domestic issues, and that at the end become also bilateral concerns.
Andrew, before I head over to you, Vidi, if you can answer this question we got from the audience. Technology is finally working with me. If you can answer it just quickly. Someone asked, would AMLO's objective of establishing himself as the leader of Latin America give him convenient air cover to hide behind more complicated regional tensions to avoid making progress with the US? And then I'll go over to you, Andrew.
Interesting question. I saw it from Pat. Well, regional tensions are the main source of the problems in the bilateral agenda, right? Like, I think we need to stop thinking that this is just a problem that happens between Mexico and the US in terms, let's say, of immigration, right? The reason why it makes sense to treat these issues as regional is because, the same problem that Mexico is facing is faced by El Salvador, by Honduras, by, so contrary to that, I do think that we need to move into dealing with these issues in a more regional way. And I'm not in favor of, this kind of like leadership thing that Amlo is going for in terms of his personalistic form of politics. But I do think that we need to address this as a regional thing. So the tensions are real and they exist, and we need to address them.
Thank you, Vidi. Now, Andrew, security and migration are interlinked, correct? So how do you see these two issues being discussed between Biden and Amlo tomorrow?
Probably, I think that won't be linked, and that's probably better. I do think there's a link. There's a question from the audience on this about why are Mexicans moving? Because Mexicans are moving in larger. They're not moving as large numbers as the press sometimes represents, because they're overcounted in the encounters data. They're mostly adults, and they try multiple times. But there is probably a doubling of the number of Mexicans. Doubling, and I don't know if it's a doubling or a tripling or it's less than doubling. But there's a significant increase from what there was 2 or 3 years ago, right? And that is notable. It's not back to 2000 levels or 2005 levels, but it is an increase. And so violence is part of that, we think, because people who were being displaced before within Mexico are increasingly looking to the U.S. Some of this is surely the slow economic recovery in Mexico, and at the same time you have a really tight labor market in the U.S. and help wanted signs, and people see this as the opportunity. The same thing that's always existed in this relationship. When people can see an opportunity to get a job in the U.S., it doesn't always pay off. Fewer and fewer Mexicans make that decision, but when you have a disparity, people go. And third, right now there's not a lot of penalty for people who try multiple times, and it used to be that you could be prosecuted on a second or third attempt if you were Mexican, and that's not happening anymore. And so there's also less disincentive. So let me just throw that out there. But on security, we wrote something a long time ago. One of the early publications of the Mexico Institute was something called Shared Responsibility, about dealing with organized crime. And part of the central argument, there were lots of arguments, but part of the central argument was this is really a shared issue. It plays out differently on both sides of the border. It's a health issue and an issue of mortality, in a much less visible way in the United States, but it's a huge issue of mortality. And it's an issue of mortality in a much more visible way in Mexico in terms of killings, right? But this is a shared responsibility. It is a shared issue. And I think what matters in the conversation tomorrow, when López Obrador thinks about security, he thinks about the U.S. going after drug traffickers. He thinks that this is sort of a U.S. agenda imposed on Mexico. If Biden wants to advance on this, the best thing he can do is talk about how this is in fact a shared issue, and that he's concerned about Americans dying, and understands that American consumers drive the market for drugs, and therefore, put the money in the pockets of the organizations in Mexico, and that he understands that, though he has many constraints to actually be able to deal with it, he is frustrated on the question of guns, and it's something that he has picked up, and it is one of his big issues, but he has some constraints from Congress. The more he can address it in that tone, I think opens up a doorway for other conversations on how you deal with organized crime, and also what he's willing to do in terms of tracking the movements of the organizations in the U.S. The U.S. doesn't, contrary to what people sometimes say in Mexico, it's not that the U.S. doesn't do anything in its own territory. The U.S. locks up lots of people, lots and lots and lots of people, probably way too many people, for drug trafficking and related offenses. What the U.S. doesn't do is deal with organized crime in a strategic way, in the same way it does outside the U.S. And that has something to do with limits on the fact we treat it as a law enforcement and not as a national security issue in the U.S. for reasons having to do with not wanting our national security agencies to do things in the U.S. over privacy concerns and other concerns of the past. But what happens is we deal with it on more of a piecemeal way in the U.S. and not in Mexico or in other countries. And there has to be sort of a commitment on the U.S. side, both to look at the consumption side, obviously, but also look at some of the way that organized crime gets organized. And it's organized in a much more decentralized way in the U.S. One should say it's not like Chapo Guzman was wandering around, with 20 people behind him in any place in the U.S. until he's put in jail. It's much more decentralized in the U.S., but we don't actually have very good mappings on this. And so actually being able to have that level conversation of saying, look, I get it, we're part of this, and that's what we want to work on with you, would really open up some room and maybe take away some of the distrust that has really seeped into the security relationship.
Yeah, I completely agree, Andrew, that if he approaches it with a shared responsibility, there could be actual results, right, and agreements that can come from this bilateral meeting. Andrew, I turn it back to you.
Thanks, everybody. We're getting lots of questions. I know we're not going to be able to cover all of them, but I think that just again shows how many things there are that we could talk about. Let me shift gears a little bit. One area I think we haven't talked about, and maybe it's another place where there are opportunities for cooperation, would be on the economic side in terms of attracting nearshoring, completing implementation of USMCA, and really finding ways to further integrate the two economies. Within that, there's always the challenge of policies that are really about Buy American versus Buy North American here in the United States. I'm not sure if any of the panelists would like to take a crack at sharing some thoughts on that piece. And is that a place where the two leaders might be able to find some synergy?
I'd like to try. It seems to me that is one of the critical points, but it's not the one or the type of problem that the two presidents are likely to engage in. Many of the issues that stem from the core agenda of the Biden administration are or entail these issues. The subsidy to electric vehicles is a case in point. These both the Canadians and the Mexicans oppose simply because those two industries are fundamental to both Canada and Mexico. If we do not invest in those industries in the next several years, then we'll be out of the picture. And those are, in the case of Mexico, it's about 50% of all exports. So it's not an insignificant issue that can be avoided. Yet it is one of the core elements of the progressive agenda that President Biden has been pursuing. So these are the kinds of things that USTR is being pressed from the Canadian and Mexican sides to work on. The USTR has other issues that they want to address, particularly on energy with Mexico. So those are the things that the two bureaucracies, in the good sense of the word, have to address.
Thanks, Luis. Ambassador Barcena.
Yes, Andrew, I will complement what Luis was saying. I think the supply chain issue is one of the key areas in which the two presidents should address that. In what level should the presidents address that? I think President Biden can explain directly to President López Obrador how he is seeing that change in supply chains, let's say less investment maybe in Asia or China, and bringing back that investment, and what the agenda of President Biden has been on the concept of reshoring, so bringing back the investments to the US. And the chance for President López Obrador, and then prepare the way for the North American Leaders Summit later on in Mexico, is to use the opportunity to see how to bring that investment to North America. So not reshoring, but nearshoring. Nearshoring. Friendly shoring, that would mean that it might go to Colombia and Ecuador and Peru and Chile. So to concentrate maybe in nearshoring, because what I think this is a golden opportunity that we are missing. So in a scale of 0 to 100, now with the supply chain, we should be receiving investment in around 80, and we are receiving maybe in around 40. So both presidents can instruct their bureaucracies and to establish, to strengthen the dialogue on this, and to find which are the obstacles to bring more nearshoring to North America. So I would say that this could be one of the main areas of dialogue and of instructions from the presidents to their bureaucracies to work with the business sector. And the business sectors of the two countries are going to meet on Wednesday. And for them, supply chain is key. And also supply chain is linked to inflation. because part of the inflation in the US is because supply chains are not working, and also in Mexico. And what the other day I was talking to one of the big exporters to Mexico, fertilizers and grains, and he was telling me there is enough fertilizer. The problem is the transport, the logistics. So this is why we need to work in supply chain as a priority. So, and this has to do with the control of the inflation, with food security, with more investment in the region. And what Luis was saying, it's very important. We have to remember that the backbone of NAFTA and USMCA is the auto industry. So if there is no agreement in the auto industry for the future on the implementation of the rules of origin and the way forward to electric vehicles, then we can break the backbone of this agreement that has given us the legal framework for the trade and investment among the three countries of North America, with all its problems and challenges, because there are many. But it has been a legal framework that has allowed to trade to grow exponentially, and also investment to grow exponentially.
Thank you. We'll go to Viri, then Andrew, and then Luis.
Thank you. So very quickly, I'd like to add something that we haven't discussed, which I think is critical to understand also Amlo, right? Which is the difference between what he says and what he does. In the case of Amlo, Amlo is very good at the performance, the political performance of saying things that may be incendiary, that may be difficult to process, that may show him as a strong leader of Mexico and both Latin America. However, on the way he acts, I think he has proven one and again that he's extremely pragmatic. Right, so we remember him during his visit with Donald Trump, extremely pragmatic, even to the point of being harshly criticized by the Mexican press. And I think that's the AMLO that we are going to observe again in Washington, a very pragmatic leader that is going to go there talking mainly about the problems that the US faces, and then using those problems to link them to possible solutions to the problems that he wants Mexico to face. I think, for example, inflation is one of them. He understands, and his team clearly understands, how inflation is one of the top concerns of the American economy right now. And therefore, he's gonna take that concern and use it to talk about giving more visas, because he will claim that having more TN visas or H2 visas or H2A visas is gonna reduce the production costs of the US. B, talking about investment and how more investment in Mexico and less in China is going to be both good for national security for the US, the nearshoring that Marta was telling, and also, create a production that is cheaper in general for goods and services. And then finally, to talk about security, but in terms of reducing extortion in Mexico, in terms of reducing the cost of production for Mexican companies that end up affecting also prices in the final goods of the US.
Thanks, Barry. Let's go to you, Andrew.
Hi, I'm going to go a different direction, which is just to answer there were two questions about the Mexican community and Mexican American community in the United States. And I just want to say, I would love to see President López Obrador coming to Washington and doing a summit with Mexican migrant leaders, saying, hopefully at least he will say something about Mexico's president in the US. I thought LA was the perfect opportunity for him to do a meeting. I mean, there is no more Mexican city in the United States than Los Angeles, right? And to make a claim that we are here, that we are part of the United States, but also the people here are still part of Mexico, and look, López Obrador is popular among the diaspora. I mean, there are people in the diaspora that don't like him, of course. And there are people that might, criticize him and all that. But overall, he won, I think it was like 2/3 of the vote in the diaspora. He's still quite popular among, many of the grassroots organizations. He is quite effective in that kind of medium. And, he would do really well, actually, in a meeting with migrant leaders and leaders of Mexican descent in this country. I mean, he could, that's the kind of thing he could pull off smoothly. But for whatever reason, he has not sought to do that. He has not sought, and look, part of it is he's from Tabasco, right? I mean, there's, I don't think he is personally familiar with the migrant experience. He processes the migrant experience as being about poverty and el pueblo and the people. He sees migrants as the extension of that, rather than as a group that is still Mexican, but is also American, that's an asset for Mexico and the United States. I don't think he sees it. I mean, I don't think he quite gets it. And look, this is true of lots of Mexican leaders who don't have direct familiarity. I mean, he's certainly not the only one that falls into that category. But I think it's a lost opportunity in general, and particularly for him, because he actually does. For Peña Nieto, it would have been more complicated. Let's face it, President Peña Nieto towards the end had a great deal of discredit among Mexican leaders in the US. President López Obrador has a lot of, has a pretty high standing, even with people who don't disagree with him, would love to see him. So I think it's a lost opportunity. I hope he does it sometime. I hope he makes a special trip to the US just to see Mexicans in the US and people of Mexican descent. This is an opportunity, Mexicans and Mexican Americans, particularly Mexican migrant leaders, though, who have a direct experience, but also Mexican descent who have cultivated the relationship and kept moving back and forth. And, Mexican business leaders and business that are Mexican descent, they're a key, bisagra, a key sort of connection between the two countries that can promote a bit of realism. I mean, they're not going to be a lobby in the way that Cubans are a lobby, or, it's a different kind of diaspora. But they can be a great transmission belt and reality check on both sides. And I would love to see this, both the Mexican government understanding that and the US government understanding that.
Luis, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that both Ambassador Barcena and Andrew have touched on the really deep fundamental issue of the relationship. President López Obrador had the enormous opportunity, still has the enormous opportunity to introduce fundamental changes, both domestic and bilateral, that are exactly what Mexico needs. He had, because he has no commitments, or he had no commitments with the past, and Mexico needs addressing some of them. Visiting the communities in the US is critical, but he has been doing exactly the opposite. He has been shunning investment. He has been undermining investors. He has been attacking some of the sources, fundamental sources of potential growth for the future, energy being the prime one, the airport being another. Those actions, those decisions do affect the possibility of Mexico making in the future. Nearshoring is the obvious thing, but it is there with some exceptions, like the electric vehicle subsidy. Nearshoring is there for the takers. It is Mexico that needs to address them. It is Mexico that needs to attract investors. That's not something that the US government has power to address. It is up to the Mexican government and to foreign investors to look into Mexico. But unless Mexico addresses its core problems, like security, like being anti-foreign investment or anti-investment in general, then there's not going to be that opportunity.
Thanks, Luis. Rafael, do you want to wrap things up? I know we went a little over, and I appreciate everybody's patience, but a great conversation.
Thank you, Andrew. I believe we just had a wonderful conversation. It's, as everybody can tell, there's many issues in the U.S.-Mexican agenda. It's very complex, it's very intense. And thank you, Luis, thank you, Andrew, thank you, Viri, and thank you, Marta, for being with us. You just gave us a wonderful panorama. This is complicated, and it's in the best interest of Mexico and the U.S. that will come to agreements in this coming visit, because there's a lot at stake for everybody. So thank you all, and back to you, Lila. You might want to have the last words. And thank you again, everybody. And we'll see you this coming Friday at 11 o'clock Mexico City time. The Wilson, the Mexico Institute and us, we will have an assessment of how the visit go. Thank you.
Yes.
Bye,
So
Lila.
thank you. On behalf of the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center and with our partner UCSD, Rafael, thank you again for doing this with us, and to all of our wonderful panelists and everybody that joined us on this webinar. I know we couldn't get to all of your questions, but thank you so much for being here. And we'll wait for you on our next webinar. Thank you all for being here, and we'll be covering Amlo's visit very closely tomorrow.